a God hater, a Bible hater, and he gets the connection. If you don't have an original Adam, you don't have an original sin, you don't need Jesus.
You know, funny that. I've actually spent a good chunk of my life now believing that I don't need Jesus anyway. But I'll be honest, the amount of times that things in the Old Testament are just thrown out as metaphor leads me to believe that you two don't understand what you're talking about as per usual. But what do I know? Maybe your incessant quote mining will finally show me the light. With all that said, let's go ahead and continue the drinking game. Every time they misrepresent something, take a shot and pretend you won't die. If you survive till the end, let me know. Also, I am not to be held responsible for any possible alcohol poisoning that comes from this decision. Alright, now that the intro's out of the way, we need to get through the customary fan art section. It's the one reprieve I have before having to listen to these two again. First, we have a lovely sketch of, well, my relationship, apparently. That one's from Kitty. Next, we have Long Suris from Lizardrius. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then finally, we have this picture of me and Ocean, my co-host for Hammered Out. That one's from Spooky Boy Ray, and thank you all for your fan art submissions, as usual. Now that the fun part of the video is out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the painful part.
Here's another short one. Atheists are highly religious too, is the title we've given it. This is from Ernst Meyer. All the atheists I know are highly religious. It just doesn't mean believing in the Bible or God. Religion is the basic belief system of the person.
Absolutely.
So this is another attempt to try to call atheism a religion, correct?
Atheists are religious too. We'll be back with more in a minute.
Oh, so you didn't actually do anything to support your point except just laughing at the camera, assuming that all of your head-nodding audience could understand what you meant from the get-go. This is a common tactic of fill-in-the-blank that I really cannot stand. Because this is a program designed to preach to the choir, as it were, anytime they're asking you to fill in the blank, they're asking you to nod your head for Jesus, in essence. So let me go ahead and say it as plainly as possible, atheism is not a religion. In fact, trying to say that it's a religion is one of the most dishonest things you can do, and it's a multi-layered issue. It's not even that atheism is not in itself a religion, as it doesn't really have any of the requirements to be a religion. It's that atheism is an epistemological stance. It is the stance that one believes that there are no gods. You can also call it a lack of belief, or however you want to define it. At the end of the day, it is still a stance of the self. It is still a propositional issue. If atheism is a religion, then theism is a religion, except theism is not. Theism is just the converse answer to the question. If you believe there are gods, then theism. If you don't believe there are gods, then atheism. If you have suspended judgment between the two, agnosticism. Considering that there are religions that do not contain a God belief, and there are God beliefs that are not part of any religion, please see deism, it is incredibly dishonest to try to say that these things are categorically the same. The only possible way that you can get to the idea that atheism is somehow a type of religion is by muddying the waters on the term so much that it can mean possibly anything. And this, too, is one of the more dishonest tactics that you'll find from people like this. The only reason that we see muddying the waters employed in the way that these two are trying to use is an effort to knock everybody down to their level, which, by the way, is at the ground. And I'm not talking above sea level, I'm talking about the lowest point where you can still be considered on the crust of the earth. I don't really understand what it is with young earth creationists, or at least those that try to propagate that shit, but dishonesty seems to run in the blood, as it were.
Right, well, let's read one more quote here from that last section about how evolution opposes Christianity and stuff.
Yes.
And this is from Susan Blackmore, and the title we gave it was Evolution Implies That Life is Meaningless. Well, from her own mouth, here's what she said. In the end, nothing matters and everything is impermanent and you can't hang on to anything. If you really think about evolution and why we human beings are here, you have to come to the conclusion that we are here for absolutely no reason at all. That can be very scary, but it can also be comforting. Well, I'd agree.
How can that be comforting?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything except her last sentence there, but
Well, of course you'd agree with everything they said, because you can misconstrue it in a way that a dishonest prick like yourself can preach to your choir and they can bob their heads. So let me go ahead and get into a distinction here real quick before you have a chance to put your own spin on things. Anything being impermanent magnifies its meaning. If this life is impermanent, then the value of every individual minute that you spend on this earth is magnified 1,000-fold compared to what it would be if you were an infinite being. This is the reason why the idea that Jesus dying on the cross was the, quote, ultimate sacrifice, unquote, is, well, a little ridiculous in my eyes. Because at that point, we're asking an infinite being to sacrifice 3 days of its time, and 3 days of its time in the scope of infinity is nothing. So God sacrificed nothing. And if any pain he felt was finite compared to the infinite bliss of his existence, we can again go ahead and assume that any torture suffered by Jesus at that time was also worth nothing if he's an infinite being. The concept of infinity does not make things infinitely more valuable. The concept of infinity makes things infinitely more cheap. If you don't believe me, think of every single thing we have on this planet that has value. What you'll find is that the things that are rarer, and therefore much more finite, are almost universally praised as being more valuable. Think of various minerals or even trading cards. Those things that are rarer and harder to come by are always going to be considered a much more valuable. Conversely, if something is infinite, there's obviously an infinite amount of it as well, and therefore it is infinitely cheap, compared to the value that we assign things based on their scarcity. Now, to reference your quote directly, the idea of life being ultimately meaningless doesn't really change anything at all, especially not about my day-to-day life. Think of it this way. In a scenario where your life has no ultimate meaning, would you still have to eat food, get dressed, go to work, and raise a family if you choose to do so? If you answered yes to this, then the ultimate meaning didn't add anything to that at all. You still had to comport yourself to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as does every other human being on the planet. If you answered no, and losing ultimate meaning would mean that you would not do these basic things for your survival, then you may be suffering from an existential crisis. In which case, I'm sorry, but your personal existential crisis does not change the validity of the conundrum. Ultimate meaning, whether you have it or not, will not change the fact that you will still have to comport yourself to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's your individual meaning that you assign to yourself, the individual goals that you make for yourself throughout your life, that actually make a change in your life. When you set up the individual goal or need to go to the gym and lose some weight, well, that's something that's actually going to change in your life. Whereas ultimate meaning, paradoxically, doesn't seem to actually add or change anything in our lives at all. It's only when we make it an individual goal to pursue whatever ultimate meaning you think exists that suddenly things start changing. Again, peddling this back to the issue where the individual meaning supersedes anything ultimate. It sounds paradoxical, but if you look at it through a pragmatic lens, this is the way things are.
You've got no purpose at all.
Yep.
The universe is just you're here, then you're not here, zero impact, nothing.
Ah yes, that zero impact. And I guess none of Thomas Edison's 1,000 patents had any impact in the long run. I guess the Wright brothers had zero impact in the world, which would conversely mean that nobody's flying here from Alaska to get to Faithless Forum. Sorry, Prophet Azad. I guess the invention of the steam engine from James Watt also had no impact, because the Industrial Revolution did nothing to impact society in America. And while I'm at it, if you're watching this from your phone, I guess Alexander Bell had no impact in the long run either, since he died in 1922. Oh, and if you're watching this on a website, I guess Tim Berners-Lee didn't have any impact at all, since he was the one who developed the HTTP protocol. You know, the hypertext transfer protocol that means the World Wide Web is freely available to anyone with a domain in it? Yeah. Zero impact whatsoever. Meanwhile, you are all holding and utilizing the long-term effects of their impact.
Doesn't matter.
By the way, there'd be no purpose of teaching that to people either.
Right, yeah.
Because there's no purpose for anything.
Yes, because teaching knowledge to future generations does not help in the long run at all. For anyone whatsoever.
It's not comforting at all.
Yep.
Let's move on. We've got another section here. Evolution opposes Christian morality. And here's a classic quote. This is from Jeffrey Dahmer. Some of you might remember him. He was. I guess we should give a bit of a background. He was a serial killer in Milwaukee in the early '90s. He killed a whole bunch of people. Some of them he cut them up and ate them. He was into cannibalism and some other things.
Ah yes, let's go into detail about Jeffrey Dahmer, because if we don't go into detail about Jeffrey Dahmer, we might lose the point that you're trying to associate evolution with a serial killer.
But he had a remarkable change of heart in prison. Here's part of what he said.
Yep.
I always believed the lie that evolution is truth. The theory of evolution is truth. That we all just came from the slime, you know, when we died. that was it, there's nothing. If a person doesn't think there's a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway.
Well, again, before you guys get a chance to misrepresent the point, given that humans are social creatures, we are going to have to comport ourselves to certain societal standards. You know, standards like not murdering everybody, not stealing from people. It is because you are a social animal that you are going to be expected to work within these social parameters. These particular social parameters have a tendency of refining themselves and evolving over time. As a result, previously accepted practices like killing people for their sexuality are starting to become less and less normative. Conversely, previously rejected practices like accepting one another's religion or sexuality are starting to become more normal. And again, as a social creature, you will find yourself dragged kicking and screaming through these societal norms whether you like it or not. Sometimes if you violate these norms, as Jeffrey Dahmer did when he killed multiple people, you find yourself in a lovely room with metal bars rent-free. You do get 3 square meals a day though, and it usually comes with a free gym membership, though I still wouldn't really recommend the accommodations.
Yeah.
Isn't that incredible?
It is incredible, and it just shows you how beliefs have consequences, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And
yeah.
What's fascinating about Dahmer's story is you can go to YouTube and you look up videos of where apparently he actually accepted Christ as his savior before he passed away in jail.
Well, he was killed in prison by somebody who was calling himself Jesus.
Yeah.
That's kind of ironic. But
yeah.
It's amazing. And in his in other biographies, a number of biographies done on this, he's considered to be one of America's worst serial killers. And it's pretty evident from his own words that he understood what salvation in Christ was all about.
Yep.
And just to think even of being forgiven of that magnitude of sins.
Exactly.
I mean, what have you done? Are there things that you've done that you think God can't forgive you for?
Yes, actually. Making this video, for one. But let's consider an appeal to emotion for just a moment here. I know it's normally considered fallacious, but I feel like it's apt in this one scenario. Just remember that in your worldview, Jeffrey Dahmer will be absolved of all of his problems, not by the people who he committed his crimes against, but by somebody who's considered over them. As a result, you now live in a reality where the people who Dahmer killed and cannibalized will be with him in the same area for eternity. You've constructed a reality where people have to live with their abusers just because they worship the same God. And they have to live with these abusers forever. This is not a thing they can escape. Personally, were I someone who was affected by Jeffrey Dahmer, there would probably be a hard choice as to whether or not I'd prefer heaven or hell if one of them meant that I had to spend eternity with dear old Jeffrey. But I don't actually have to have that particular dilemma because I don't share your worldview. And if you'll pardon the irony, thank God for that.
Well, it's very likely that God forgave Jeffrey Dahmer.
That's right.
And it's interesting, he also in those biographies, he started ordering creation books in prison. And then you can see how he understands the background, the moral
creation
basis.
books countered the evolutionary teaching, and he came to realize evolution's not true, and he came to believe that God exists.
Again, evolution has nothing to say over whether or not a god exists. It's categorically completely different, and by completely throwing these two into the same category, you are committing the fallacy of category error. But I'm going to ignore that fallacy, like the other 10, 20, 30 so that you've actually gone through, and point out the other problem with your argument. Namely the one where you've just associated the idea of the theory of evolution leading Jeffrey Dahmer logically down the path of a serial killer. And in doing so, creating a narrative with a counter-treatment to this disease of evolution theory that you've constructed are your books that you are currently advertising. You created a fake disease and are now trying to sell the cure. Believe in evolution caused somebody to be a serial killer, according to you, and the thing that cured this madness of the mind from Jeffrey Dahmer were creation books, of which you are actively trying to peddle. If it has not been made abundantly clear how dishonest these two are being, hopefully this one scenario right here is enough to make my case. If not, we still have plenty to get through, don't worry.
Yeah, you know, and I think Hebrews 11:6 speaks to that. Those who come to him must come to him by faith, but must believe he exists.
Of course.
And when you believe evolution can explain everything, you don't believe God exists.
Yeah.
Nobody believes evolution can explain everything. Evolution, for instance, can't explain mathematics. It cannot explain nuclear fusion. It cannot explain the countless engineering conundrums that we've ran across and usurped in order to create many of the modern inventions of our time. Evolution explains none of these. And you know what? That's fine, because it doesn't have to. Evolution explains one thing: the diversification of species. It's not an explanation for the origin of living beings, and it most certainly is not some attempt to replace religion or God belief with some type of scientism. It's a single theory, focused on a single issue, and it does a very good job explaining that single issue. You know what doesn't do a good job of explaining that issue? God done it.
Well, let's go to another quote here. This is from the section, "Evolution does not help science make discoveries." That's a shocking one for most people. Yeah, well, it's science, you know.
Okay.
Anyway, Philip Skell said this: "None of the great discoveries in biology and medicine over the past century depended on guidance from Darwinian evolution. It provided no support."
Well, Philip Skell is definitely an interesting person to read over. I did a little bit of research on this guy after looking at this quote, and it turns out that he has a huge bone to pick with evolution. To his credit, he was a professor at Penn State University before he died in 2010. The problem here, though, is that Skell is a chemist, not a biologist. He has a particular opinion when it comes to something in biology, but that's not his wheelhouse. So just as you wouldn't ask a biologist not to say something about, say, astronomy in a professional sense, so too would you not ask a chemist to make an assumption about biology. In science, there is a lot of deferring to the experts, people who have dedicated their lives to a particular field and study. Usually that field of study will be very narrow in scope. As a result, many of the highly specialized individuals that actually have to go through these narrow fields of study would be the people who you ask when it comes to a question about their field, not somebody in a tangentially related field. For examples of people who are in these fields and have pointed out that Philip Skell is wrong, there are Ness and Williams, authors of the book Why We Get Sick, The New Science of Darwinian Medicine, who explain in detail how understanding evolution helps contribute to our understanding of how medicine functions. Their book also details several instances of evolution being utilized as a framework to help us understand modern medicine. P.Z. Myers, who is in this wheelhouse, has also explained why this entire viewpoint of Skell's is wrong. Gary Hurd also responded to this on his blog, Stones and Bones, noting that Skell seems to disparage the entire field of paleontology and evolutionary biology. Do you know why he disparages these fields? Because he was a creationist, and his creationist viewpoint means that these were entirely juxtaposed to his personal wants and needs. His view had nothing to do with his degree in science. It had everything to do with his religion. However, by using this quote, it seems that these two want to paint a picture that he was using his views on science to paint his views on the theory of evolution. But doing just a little bit of digging shows that that's not the case. It turns out that it was in fact his religion that made him deny a very basic scientific field, one that is no less valid than his own. This is like talking to a highly skilled biologist who says that the entire field of astronomy must be false because we live on a flat Earth. If it sounds dumb, that's because it is. Your personal opinion does not invalidate an entire field of scientific study. What findings are discovered in that field of scientific study, in fact, would invalidate your opinion. It sucks, but reality has this nasty habit of doing what it's going to do, with or without your feelings being considered.
And see, so many people, well, if we don't have evolution in schools, we won't be able to have science for our kids, and we won't be able to do good science.
Yeah, that's the reason that's given off.
It's called history. That's what it's called. So no wonder it's not going to help you do science.
There's another quote here that's similar to that, and we've titled it, "Other branches of biology do not take evolution into account." Here's the quote. "In fact, over the last 100 years, almost all of biology has proceeded independent of evolution, except evolutionary biology itself. Molecular biology, biochemistry, physiology have not taken evolution into account at all."
You know, with every other quote you've used, you have actually sourced the original person who made the quote. But here, you seem to not mention the originator of this quote. This particular quote was cited from Dr. Mark Kirschner in Jonathan Sarfati's book, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Refuting Dawkins on Evolution. The full context of the quote seems to be that Kirschner, the originator of the quote, was lamenting the fact that to him, it seemed like many of these sciences were working in isolation of one another. He was lamenting the fact that many of these sciences, especially in the branches of biology have been failing to take an interdisciplinary approach and recognize what they can learn from evolution. He was making a point that the other sciences would be better off if they were taking their notes from the evolutionary science category as well. He was not, as you are showing here, trying to say that evolutionary biology doesn't have merit because other fields of research weren't learning from it. He was lamenting the fact that these other fields of research were not taking an active effort in learning in an interdisciplinary fashion from evolutionary biology. His quote actually works against what you're trying to sell in your book. But by not saying the author's original name or saying the book where you, I would assume, got this quote from in its mind fashion, is either a demonstration of your immense ignorance on the topic or an attempt to fool your obviously gullible audience. Trust me, I have done the Discount Hoven series. I am very well aware of the people who read your magazine.
You know, I think these kind of quotes are great eye-openers for people who have that kind of blind devotion, oh, this is science, and so on.
Right.
To actually, it shakes them up because, you know, it's not like people who are involved in science don't recognize some of these problems. I mean, people that believe in evolution themselves are confronted daily on the fact that evolution doesn't seem to be working.
You seem to be projecting, because those are actually issues that I have found with Christianity. Christians are confronted every day with problems that their Bible cannot solve, because it's not working. Blind faith is also what you actually seem to have in your book. So what it seems to me is that here all you're doing is projecting all of your own problems and insecurities onto a field of science that is very well established.
They can't observe it, etc. It's not real science.
Right.
Again, going back to the quote that you just mined earlier, it is a real science, and the quote you just said, when viewed in its original context, shows that it is in fact a real science.
Yeah. We'll have more when we get back.
Copying the work or design of another person without giving them due credit is called plagiarism. But even though plagiarism is widely regarded as a terrible thing, ironically, it has actually inspired a whole new field of science known as biomimetics. As the name suggests, biomimetics involves mimicking or copying designs seen in the biological world. For instance, the geometric eyes of lobsters have inspired X-ray telescope design, and the amazing properties of spider silk are inspiring chemists in the production of ultra-strong materials. Since scientists are continually uncovering excellent examples of design in nature that are worth copying, isn't it reasonable to conclude that our creator must have designed them? And if they are copying the work of a creator and not giving him due credit, isn't that just another form of plagiarism?
I don't know. Is quote mining another form of lying? All of the things that you listed are actually explained very easily by the theory of evolution. Different species becoming highly adapted and highly specialized for very particular things is, in fact, what we would expect from species who have been evolving for thousands upon thousands of years. But it's okay. Go ahead and just continue sitting in your Ray comfort zone using rhetoric like this to make it seem like your beliefs are reasonable. Note, your belief in a god or in a creator deity is perfectly reasonable. There is no problem with that. But using that as some sort of bludgeoning device to say that an entire scientific field that is well-sourced and well-documented is somehow invalid, that is what's unreasonable. If your answer to the question of our origins is I don't know, and you decide that you want to use God in there the same way that other people use abiogenesis, then that's fine. Until abiogenesis is determined to be a fact and accepted as a theory, then that's okay being used as an origin for life. But it's when you take something that is demonstrably true, like evolution, and try to use your creator deity to falsify it, which in and of itself is an unfalsifiable thing, that is when you start committing intellectual dishonesty of the scope that we've seen so far. But maybe I'm putting too much thought in your horribly produced commercial.
So here's a classic quote about those evolutionary tree drawings that you see in textbooks. This is from Stephen Jay Gould. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not evidence of fossils. There's a candid admission.
Ah yes, Stephen Jay Gould, one of the best examples of a horribly quote-mined person. If you look at the entirety of the quote, it's actually Stephen Jay Gould arguing against gradualism. He's actually mentioned in his article Evolution as Fact and Theory, published in 1981, that transitions are often found in the fossil record. Preserved transitions are not common, and should not be according to our understanding of evolution, but they are also not entirely wanting, as creationists often claim. Faced with these facts of evolution and the philosophical bankruptcy of their own position, position, creationists rely upon distortion and innuendo to buttress their rhetorical claims. If I sound sharp or bitter, indeed I am, for I have become a major target of these practices. He then goes on to say that he counts himself as an evolutionist who argues for a jerky and episodic rather than smoothly gradual pace of change. So, from the horse's own mouth, this is him responding to people constantly misusing this exact quote. So instead of me trying to defend him, I just went ahead and dug up his own counterquote in order for him to defend himself. The full context of that entire discussion is in a link in talkorigins.org that I have in the description below. That's also where you'll find the Stones and Bones article, as well as other articles that I have talked about and discussed here. Also, I know this is a lengthy video, and I'm sorry that it's taking so long to get through this, but there's a lot to unpack with every one of these misrepresentations. Hopefully you guys are willing to stick with me for the long run.
The branches, at the end, at the tips of the branches, there we see the animals that are living today, obviously.
Right.
So, okay, there's data for that.
Yeah.
And what about the branches? Nothing.
Yeah, if you remove them, you just see a bunch of animals.
Strange. To me, it seems like the most apt counter-argument to this entire bit of drivel is that if we removed these two's personal integrity, we would see no change. That is to say, there is none.
Where'd they come from? God made them. Okay, well, here's another quote. It's from the Origin of Life section. Now, many evolutionists will try to say that origin of life is not part of evolution. Evolution is just part, But look, if you're an atheist, you have to believe life came from non-life.
They say that because they haven't got a clue how life came from non-life.
Right.
Again, as I pointed to before, if your answer to the origin of life is I don't know, then you can use God. That's fine. I have no problem with that. But it's also equally valid to make an appeal to abiogenesis. Now granted, if we get to the point where abiogenesis is accepted as a theory and we're able to recreate it in the lab perfectly fine, completely, mind you, not just the few amino acids we've managed to reproduce so far, then the last shaky leg that your position has immediately falls out. And I'm sure that terrifies you. Or maybe you're just too stupid to understand that that's the logical end result of that set of circumstances. Regardless, anyone believing in the theory of evolution does not have to utilize it for an origin of living forms, considering that that is categorically not what evolution talks about, but I don't know how many times I'm going to have to say that. Hopefully, none of you have dropped dead from your drinking game that we began with.
So Paul Davies, a Bible skeptic, obviously, he says evolution requires already living creatures to operate. So he said, obviously, Darwinian evolution can operate only if life of some sort already exists. Strictly, it requires not life in its full glory, only replication, variation, and selection. Darwinism can offer absolutely no help in explaining that all-important first step, the origin of life. But if the central principle of life fails to explain the origin of life, we are left with a problem. What other principle or principles might explain how it all began? And see, he's admitting that they have to explain how it all began.
Yeah.
But what? It's not categorically part of what evolution is trying to explain, you nimrods. This is like saying that engineering isn't a thing because it relies on math, which is categorically separate. Or like saying that science isn't a thing because it relies on philosophy to get its scientific method. It's like saying the button on your cheesy coat isn't a thing because it relies on your coat for suspension. The mere fact that evolution requires life, and thus an origin for life is something that we still need an answer to, does not invalidate the theory of evolution.
Natural selection is not going to work because it only selects from genetic information already there. Genetic mutations only mutates a genetic code already in existence.
That's already there.
So he's admitting, well, those Darwinian mechanisms don't explain anything. How do you get life from non-life? Well, you don't.
Yeah.
No, the honest answer is that you don't know, which for you two seems like it's going to be the honest answer for a lot of things.
He's saying the same things that CMI that we've been saying for a long time and get criticized for it, yet here's an evolutionist admitting the same thing.
Of course, and the reason you get criticized for it is because when you say stuff like this, it's in a dishonest attempt to bring people to your favorite god. It's in an attempt to sell magazines and books. You know, the same books that you claim helped change Jeffrey Dahmer from a ravenous serial killer and cannibal to a good Jesus boy. Whereas when someone who's actually studied in this field is mentioning something about evolution, what they're trying to say isn't what you're trying to say they're saying. Usually, they are being intellectually honest, saying that, hey, we don't have an answer for this particular problem. But it's not a problem with the theory that you're trying to criticize. It's a categorically separate, yet tangentially related, issue. The difference here is that on one hand, there's the option of I don't know, which is the honest answer. You can say I don't know with an appeal that you lean towards something like a biogenesis, a creator deity, or otherwise, or you can be dishonest and say you know what the origin was and appeal to whatever you want. In your case, a creator deity. Problem is, though, you don't know that. Only until it's been demonstrated true can you actually make the claim of knowledge. Until then, it sits firmly in the category of belief, which would be the honest position. But you two don't seem to know much about honest positions, except, I guess, maybe missionary.
Yeah.
All right, we can move on to section DNA and genetics. It's on page 55 here. Here's another quote. I really think this phrase, junk DNA, does need to be totally expunged from the lexicon. It was a slightly throwaway phrase to describe very interesting phenomena that were discovered in the 1970s. I am now convinced that it's just not a very useful way of describing what's going on.
Junk DNA.
Junk DNA was the non-coding parts of the DNA. It's quite repetitive and so on. And evolutionists thought, well, that's just the evolutionary leftovers and that kind of thing. And it doesn't, there was evolutionary excuses made for it.
Yeah.
Whereas
it was like vestigial organs applied to DNA. That's kind
sort
of the
like that was
concept,
one
right?
of the
Leftover
ideas, yeah.
junk ideas and stuff like that.
What that quote's talking about is lamenting the problem with still using a moniker that no longer applies, as we've understood that non-coding DNA is not necessarily junk. It was only called junk during the 1970s when we thought it had no purpose. It was originally suggested that over 98% of the human genome doesn't encode any protein sequences. It is, however, becoming clear that at least some of that DNA is integral to the function of our cells, particularly when talking about gene activity. So this quote that you're talking about is lamenting the layman still using an old term that has since been thrown away. It's much like how lay people are still using terms like psychopath and sociopath, even though they were abandoned once the DSM-5 came out. We still talk about sociopaths and psychopaths and juxtapose the merits of the two different states to one another, even though, as of the DSM-5, these have all been put in a different category of different anti-personal disorders. The science behind these disorders have moved on, but the lay people still continue to talk about these disorders in their originated forms, or at the very least, the forms that they were originally introduced to them as. This is no different than the problem with junk DNA. The science has moved on. This quote is lamenting the lay person.
Well, this next quote from John Maddock, an expert in genetics, he reveals the motives. That's what we've actually titled it, evolutionary motives for defending junk DNA hypothesis. Now, he says the argument of a largely non-functioning genome is invoked by some evolutionary theorists in the debate against the proposition of intelligent design of life on Earth, particularly with respect to the origin of humanity. In essence, the argument posits that the presence of non-protein coding, or so-called junk DNA, that comprises 90% of the human genome, is evidence for the accumulation of evolutionary debris by blind Darwinian evolution, and argues against intelligent design, as an intelligent designer would presumably not fill the human genetic instruction set with meaningless information. Well, the problem, of course, is that they've now, people like Maddock have studied this so-called junk DNA, and they're now saying that like 98% of our DNA they know is coding for certain things and you know, controlling certain factors. So it has a purpose.
It has a purpose.
And of
it's
course,
not just leftover
it
garbage.
fits exactly.
It's not 98%. We know that some of it has a purpose. We do not know about all of it. Moreover, if you read that quote, it should be very obvious to anybody listening that what he's talking about is the issue of the creationism versus evolutionism battle. You know, the battle that wouldn't be fought if people like you didn't exist. There are certain people, in their attempt to defend evolution, who will hold on to things that aren't necessarily considered the scientific consensus anymore. The only reason these arguments are held to by these people is in an effort to try to fight against people like you who are trying to undermine actual real science. There wouldn't be so many people who are enthusiastic about the study of evolution if it weren't viewed through the lens of being completely against your Christian dogma. And unfortunately, that lens was constructed by you, the creationists, and has been propagated by its peddlers and followers over the decades. as evidenced by the fact that I had to reference Stephen Jay Gould defending himself 40 years ago on people misappropriating his quotations.
What creationists would believe. We've got a perfect code in the beginning and it degrades. We'd see some degradation, but most of it would still be functional.
Right. Yeah. Okay, moving on. This is about bird evolution here. Of course, you've likely heard that birds evolved from dinosaurs, or some birds, that kind of thing. So here is Ann Gibbons, a quote about, and we've titled it, "Theropod lungs could not have evolved into bird lungs." She says this: "Here was the first evidence in soft tissue that theropods had the same kind of compartmentalization of lungs, liver, intestines that you would find in a crocodile and not in a bird." Rubin uses this lung evidence to argue not only that dinosaurs were incapable of high rates of gas exchange needed for warm-bloodedness, but also that their bellows-like lungs could not have evolved into the high-performance lungs of modern birds.
So not all scientists are agreeing with what people see in the media all the time. Oh yeah, we figured all this stuff out. There's great controversy in the evolutionary community.
So this is the first quote they've actually managed to pull from an actual scientific journal. The page count on this is 2, so it shouldn't take that long for me to read. Unfortunately, it is behind a paywall. So unfortunately, the most I can do, given that I can't find the original quote in its entirety because I do not trust this representation of it, is that there are experts who still argue whether dinosaurs were hot-blooded, agile, and active, like the cunning predators in Jurassic Park, or if they were perchance more sluggish and cold-blooded. What we do find, though, is that big meat-eating dinosaurs have a complex system of air sacs similar to the setup found in today's birds. The lungs of theropod dinosaurs, carnivores that walked on 2 legs and had bird-like feet, likely pumped air into hollow sacs in their skeletons, as is the case with our modern birds. This is something that was originally considered unique to birds, but we've found that it actually seems to be common in their ancestors as well, at least present in some of them anyway. Oh, by the way, it should be noted that the Ann Gibbons quote that you're using is from the 1990s, and the study that shows that the air sacs were used the same way birds were was done in 2005, so by using more recent data, it seems like even if I were to find that the context of the original quote meant what you said it did, it seems that more recent research has shown that that is not necessarily the case. Again, I'll have an article linked below as I usually do, so you can do your own reading and fact check me.
We'll be back in just one moment.
Looking for a single resource that totally destroys evolution? You need Evolution's Achilles heels.
Looking for a single resource that destroys the merits of the Bible being a moral book? Just read the Bible.
We're going to try to squeeze in a few more quotes in the time that we have left here. And here's a long quote, but it's fascinating. It's about the surprising features found on Surtsey Island, an island that was formed in the 60s from a volcanic eruption. Surtsey Island, it's geological features. That's what this quote's talking about, because we're always told about how things take so long for evolution to work and evolutionary processes. Well, early one morning in 1963, a fissure opened in the bed of the Atlantic Ocean about 30 kilometers south of Iceland. Red-hot magma rushed up through the crack in the Earth's crust, and icy cold water poured down onto it. Over 3 more years of intermittent eruptions, an island formed and solidified above the waves before the eyes of an astonished world. Even as early as Surtsey's first spring in 1964, when scientists first tentatively set foot on the new island, they discovered it was no longer barren. Those first visitors found a fly on the shore and some seeds, apparently dropped by passing birds. The following spring, they were greeted in the high tide line by the green shoots and pretty white flowers of a sea rocket, its roots sunk into the ash and in full bloom. The scientists swiftly declared Surtsey a natural reserve to which they would control access. But from the first, the speed, ingenuity, and sheer unpredictability of nature's colonization of Surtsey wrong-footed them. This was an ecosystem created in the first days largely by accident. There was no complex evolutionary adaptation to the surroundings, nor even a replication of ecosystems on neighboring islands. What came, came. Despite the somewhat haphazard arrival of species, says Bogthor Magnusson of the Icelandic Institute of Natural History, one thing led to another, and we now have a fully functioning ecosystem on Surtsey. The plants support insects that attract birds that bring more plants. The best joke is that there is already fossils on Surtsey. It seems that the remains of mollusks and other creatures sealed into sedimentary rocks on the seabed were blasted into the air during the Great Explosion and helped build up the new island. The island has excited geographers who marvel that canyons, gullies, and other land features that typically take tens of thousands of millions of years to form were created in less than a decade. Nobody has seen
amazing.
mountains and gullies form over tens of thousands of years.
Nobody's been around that long.
Yeah, because we've seen them happen very, very quickly. Why believe that it takes a long time then?
It's amazing.
Because in the case of gullies, we have instances where we can tell exactly how long it took for certain rocks to erode. We can then use radiometric dating to determine if the age of these rocks is consistent with the rate of erosion that we find, and as a result we come to the conclusion that it takes many of these gullies many, many, many years to actually be formed. We also are aware of plate tectonics and how slow going a process that can be in order to create certain mountains. The reason that we believe these things is not because we've observed them happen instantaneously, because humans don't live long enough for that to be the case. It's because we have a mountain of evidence that actually lead us to that conclusion. You can get some of these features rather instantly depending on the circumstances involved, like say here, a volcanic eruption. Also, wouldn't it be evidence for evolution that there are plants that have been evolved in such a way that they can grow in the surface that was present on Suris? Anyways, the mere fact that you have a quote that shows that there was an event that happened rapidly does not mean that all events of landmass formation follow the exact same pattern that you observed here. We know that there are multiple methods in which landmasses can be formed or unearthed, volcanic activity being one of the more instantaneous ones. Now, if you want to make the case that everything on Earth was formed by volcanic activity and that plate tectonics aren't a thing, then I guess you can go ahead and try making that case. I'll go ahead and grab the popcorn because that would be a demonstration I would find quite hilarious.
Yes. Let's end with one more. Here's one on radiometric dating from Nature magazine. Nature has probably got to be the world's leading science journal. It's fascinating here. Okay, to pin down the age of older rocks, geologists rely on radiometric dating, which tracks the radioactive decay of elements within a sample. But in the past decade, it has become clear that the results from different techniques and different labs don't agree.
Wow. There's a great admission because you talk to so many people. Yeah, but what about those radiometric dating, their absolute dating methods and all this stuff? Not
but
really.
There's a variety of different isotopes that evolutionists can use and different methods within radioisotopes that are all labeled radioisotope dating. And it's like measuring, if we want to measure the size of this table here, and we have a metal ruler and we have a wooden ruler, and we get two totally different measurements.
That has got to be one of the most dishonestly dumbed down methods of explaining radiometric dating to a layperson that I have ever heard. I'm sorry, but your example of a metal and wooden ruler are not adequate to explain the intricacies of radiometric isotope dating. But if you want to try to take a quote from Nature magazine out of context by itself, then go ahead. From what I can tell though, and I have an article linked below to support my case, is that usually when these methods don't agree, it comes down to various laboratory errors. And like with practically any experiment, if you come across a laboratory error, then you're going to get a flawed end result. Unfortunately, I can't seem to find this exact quote that you're pulling from Nature, but given your track record so far, I'm going to go ahead and say that the pattern holds true, that you're misrepresenting it. For those who want to disagree with me on radiometric dating, I've also provided the equation for the radiometric timescale in the description below. It even notes in the article showing the equation that the number of parent and daughter isotopes in each specimen are determined by various kinds of analytical methods. As a result, radiometric dating is simple in theory, but laboratory procedures get increasingly complex. The principal difficulty lies in measuring precisely very small amounts of isotopes. As a result, sometimes errors will occur. As per another article that I'm linking below, it should be noted that a few laboratory errors that can be chalked up to human issue do not undermine an entire scientific field that has proven consistency.
What? Something's wrong with your rulers.
It doesn't work. Anyways, we're out of time.
Yep.
We'll see you next week when we talk about how does genetics point to design. We'll see you next week.
Oh, thank every unholy abomination that has ever skirted across my nightmares. This is finally over. This was a particularly research-heavy episode, considering that I've had to go through and find each individual quote where I was able to, or find the more recent research that undermines the previous research that you used in order to cling on to your belief position. Hopefully, I've managed to provide most of you with enough information to show that these guys are being incredibly dishonest. If you are a creationist, I would hope that you don't use these arguments anymore, since each one of them is demonstrably false and problematic. And if you do, then you're just as dishonest as these two. And if you want to be in the bargain bin with these two scumsuckers, I'm not going to stop you, but I would at least recommend against the practice. Hopefully none of you died from alcohol poisoning. If you did, well, I guess you can't let me know in the comment section. Anyways, I'm sorry this episode is uploading a little later than usual, but I hope you guys enjoy it. I know it's been a longer one, but thank you for sticking it through with me. Also, please remember to subscribe and do the Patreon thing and all that other fun stuff if you have a chance to. As always, guys, we're gonna roll into the Patreon slides, but insert end of video tagline here.